Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In our previous lecture, we talked about the French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and we now move to the discussion of the Geneva Peace Conference and the Geneva Accords coming out of it in 1954. In this final lecture about the French Indochina War, and in fact about French involvement in Vietnam period, we'll conclude with a brief comparison between the efforts of the French in their war and the Americans in the war to come. The Geneva Conference and the accords coming out of it took place within the context of the Cold War. Containment was the guiding ideology from the American perspective. Containment seemed to have worked in Korea, and now pressure was building to decide on American commitment in Vietnam. In a future lecture, I'll be talking more extensively about the full Cold War context and American involvement. Delegations had assembled at Geneva a few weeks before the battle at Dien Bien Phu concluded. But it was the day after that defeat by the French that they began to discuss the situation in Indochina. 9 delegates attended, including Laos, Cambodia, and 2 from Vietnam. Other representatives were from France, the United States, the British, Chinese, and Soviets. The conference was dominated by the major powers. Despite Viet Minh victory over France, they were unable to dictate their own terms. The United States used the threat of military intervention to strengthen France and to discourage China and the Soviet Union from firmly backing the Viet Minh. The French skillfully played their role in between the great powers, hinting that they might reject American plans for the European defense community, which I'll talk about in the next lecture, so the Soviets would not support the Viet Minh. Soviets also didn't have major interest in Southeast Asia at that point, so they were willing to moderate on Vietnam. The Chinese were wary of American intervention, so they joined the Soviets in encouraging the Viet Minh to reach an agreement. The Soviets and Chinese made it clear to Ho Chi Minh that he must compromise with the French. Gradually, the two sides worked out an agreement. There would be a temporary partitioning of Vietnam to allow the regrouping of military forces. Elections would be held to unify the country 2 years later, in 1956. And there would be a ceasefire, officially coming on July 19, 1954. With a settlement imminent, the United States, headed by Dwight Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, made a fateful decision. They decided to intervene in South Vietnam and take the place of the French in containing communism there. It was clear that North Vietnam would be under communist control. The United States decided to intervene and stop the spread of communism, or so they hoped, to Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam. The details were ironed out, and settlement was signed on July 19, 1954. A ceasefire was declared, and Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel. I would note that this partition was intended to be temporary and would be removed after the elections to come in 1956. But those of you with any understanding of Vietnamese history in this period and the American war in Vietnam itself know that that partition was indeed not temporary, or at least lasted long after 1956, and we'll talk about that process in a future lecture. The United States was not especially happy with the Geneva Accords, and ultimately did not publicly endorse them. They were unhappy, in particular, that North Vietnam had fallen into communist hands. The United States didn't sign the accords, leaving them free to either follow them or not, as was convenient. Still, they didn't publicly condemn the accords either. They saw some value there. It could have been worse. The Viet Minh had not really been rewarded for their clear military victory over the French. Only Chinese and Soviet pressure had forced Ho Chi Minh to accept the settlement. Also, the accords did allow for a 2-year window to improve conditions, and the United States thought that in those 2 years they could create a valid alternative to Ho Chi Minh and that he would win the 1956 elections. They would then provide a genuine alternative to communism. From his end, Ho Chi Minh thought the same way. He was willing to accept the settlement because significant American intervention would be a serious problem. Now there would not be military intervention, and the Viet Minh could solidify their already strong political position. He, too, was confident that he would win the 1956 elections. As the United States prepared to intervene in Vietnam, they did not carefully or properly recognize what had gone wrong for the French. They thought that the French had not fought long enough or hard enough. Eisenhower and Dulles did not appreciate the difficulties the French had faced in waging a war in Vietnam. They believed the United States could do it better. The United States would offer the full economic and military might to the government and convince the Vietnamese that they offered a valid alternative. But the Americans seemed to come at this question the wrong way. The question was not why had France lost the war, but why had the Viet Minh won? The people were united against the French and their colonial imposition. The Viet Minh were vastly more popular and determined, and the leadership of Ho Chi Minh was unassailable. Thus, the United States would ultimately make many of the same mistakes the French had made. With that in mind, as we bid adieu to the period of French influence and involvement in Vietnam, let's take a moment to compare the French and American efforts during their military experiences there. First of all, there are some key differences between the American experience and the French. For the Americans, there was no Dien Bien Phu. There was no great and obvious military setback, at which point the war might be declared over. The Americans also had much greater use of helicopters and air power than the French, and on the whole, they deployed a much greater military force than the French did. And yet, there were many similarities, and in fact, many more similarities and important similarities than there were differences. The duration of the war and the outcome was very similar. The American War lasted directly from about 1965 to 1972, 7 to 8 years, almost exactly the same length as the French Indochina War. Both French and American efforts began with high hopes and optimistic predictions and ended in disaster. Both the French and Americans enjoyed enormous technological advantages, and yet they were not enough to overcome the enemy. Neither the French nor the Americans were able to create a stable and realistic alternative to the communists. And neither were successful in developing South Vietnamese forces that were capable of waging the war on their own. In both cases, eroding support on the home front forced both to withdraw in failure. And in both wars, the Viet Minh employed skillful and patient strategies to prolong the war and further weaken support on the home front of the foreign nations. This war between the elephant and the tiger that Ho Chi Minh had described in fighting against the French was exactly the same strategy they deployed in fighting against the Americans. For both the Americans and the French, veterans of the war in Vietnam left with extremely mixed feelings. Many felt they had fought for an empty cause, and many returned to a mixed or negative reception from their fellow countrymen on the home front. And on the whole, the defeats for both nations had a devastating effect on national morale and would shape diplomacy for decades in the aftermath of the war. In short, we look back in hindsight and recognize there were abundant lessons that the Americans might have learned from the French experience in Vietnam, perhaps chief and foremost, to not get involved at all. And yet, American leadership in that moment didn't recognize these lessons and thought they could do a better job in controlling Vietnam than the French had. Thus, American involvement in Vietnam began.